Welcome to Lowndes Legal Talk, where we share perspectives on legal and business issues affecting you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Ferran Arimon. I am an attorney here at Lowndes, and joining me today is Drew Sorrell. He is the chair of our e-discovery, cybersecurity, and privacy group. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about cybersecurity and particularly its impact in a work-from-home environment. October is Cybersecurity Month, so we're hosting this Q&A session today in honor of that. So to get us started, Drew, I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about what cybersecurity, what it means exactly, because I know a lot of people aren't really familiar with that term.
Good question. It actually means several different things in different contexts, but at its most simplest, it is security surrounding the information that you have, which would include not only access control, but also integrity, meaning not only do I want to keep the bad guys away from my data, both electronic and physical, but I also want to make sure that my data is that my data has integrity in the sense that I know that it hasn't been changed or altered, or to the extent that it has been changed or altered, that was permitted and I know what the changes were. And there are other more complicated definitions depending on the context, but that's a good working definition.
Understood. And as a practical matter, what exactly does that mean for us in the good times and in the now times?
Well, in the good times, it used to be, in air quotes, pre-COVID, that security was in one sense easier. And it was easier because when you had your security team, your technology team working on the technical aspects of security, you could do that with essentially one point, one location, and one facility that you were securing, with some exceptions for the people that work on the road and stuff like that. The problem is that we now have probably a fairly ad hoc transfer from working at home, or excuse me, from working at the office to working at home. And that then has attendant challenges to it with respect to security and understanding who's accessing and when they're accessing it and so on. And there's more to it than that, but it's basically a much more complicated issue than it ever was before, not that it was simple to begin with.
Understood. So as an organization, what are some of the major cybersecurity threats that our viewers should be aware of?
Well, ransomware continues to be a huge issue for all companies, and that includes not only just the traditional bad guys getting lucky and somebody opening up an email that they probably shouldn't have, but also state actors and organized crime have gotten into the game and have become much more sophisticated in their ability to attack systems. So pile on top of that the problem that you have with communications that now exist. So for instance, John can't talk to Sally because Sally's no longer down the hall. Sally's now at her house. And in order to get a hold of Sally, I have to call her Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, whatever. And that sometimes can create challenges that causes people to defer simply to email. The problem that gives rise to is that, are you really sure that the person that's answering and responding to your email is the right person? And in fact, in this hypothetical, is actually Sally. And so that's one of the big issues that we're dealing with.
Understood. And I guess that's how an organization has changed their approach now in a work from home environment, as opposed to when we were all back at working in the office.
Right. And it's always been an issue with getting employees trained and getting leadership to support that training and getting leadership to embrace a culture of security. What that then requires, once you've set the baseline, is actually to expand that notion as to what the security envelope and the span of control is or needs to be. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the CEO and the treasury officers and the persons that are in charge of the budget need to understand that it's now a much more complicated security process, and in one sense supports an expenditure of money for what is almost a concierge level of security from IT. Again, what does that mean? What that means is that now I have employees who are working from home. They're working on residential level connections. They're using residential level firewalls. They are sitting in their house with their laptop, their desktop, or whatever. And the question is, have those been updated? Do they have malware protection on them? Do they have the latest operating system? How strong is their firewall? Who has access to that system? Is it always turned off at the end of the day? Is it left on? And all of those bits and pieces go into the question of how much more difficult it is just to secure the open access point that you have to have for the employee to work. Along those lines, it's become more expensive and problematic for the security folks and the IT folks to monitor who's logging in. And so again, as I'm wont to say, what does that mean? What that means is that if I've got everybody in an office and accessing from an internal point, that's easier in one sense to control and monitor, because depending on the place, you've got everybody signed in at roughly the same time and everybody signed out at roughly the same time every day. And so it's not as hard to see outliers. But if I now have people working from home and they're adjusting their schedules to deal with the challenges of daily life, so that instead of having a 9 to 5-ish monitoring schedule, I've now got people that are signing on at 9 p.m. who wouldn't otherwise do that. I now need to figure out, is that a valid sign-in, or is that somebody that's actually breaking into the system with stolen credentials or some other nefarious means? All of that requires more budget, more time, and more training to deal with.
That makes sense. So it seems like the fact that we have more are being accessed, that data is being accessed at different times and from more access points is kind of becomes a logistical nightmare in terms of monitoring user interaction with your system.
Right, and it's not only that, it's also a training and procedures and policies question. So again, for instance, kind of carrying on this stream of problems, the other problem you have is that to the extent you've done the right thing and you've written your information security plan down, you now need, kind of at the spur of the moment in March of this year, to have begun to write down changes to that so that you now have written remote access policies and procedures, both from what the employee is supposed to do and not do, as well as what the IT folks are supposed to do and not do, how management works and deals with that and supports the overall security function. And then the question of training is to make sure that you've actually got everybody in the loop with respect to, this is the new way we do things, and then you can be auditing that to make sure there's comprehension that everybody's actually doing the training they're supposed to.
Okay. So obviously maintaining the integrity and ability to access data in and of itself is important, but what legal compliance requirements should organizations be aware of as it relates to cybersecurity?
Well, interesting question. Different types of businesses have different regulatory requirements. If I'm a bank, I'm going to be subject to Graham-Leach-Bliley, which is a federal law that to some extent talks about what security is. If I handle credit card payments, there's a payment card industry requirement that overlays that. Medical, again, is HIPAA and high tech, and so on. If I'm in California, CCPA. If I'm dealing with people who are present in Europe, GDPR, and so on. And I say that to demonstrate that there is really a patchwork quilt as to what is required. As I understand it, Massachusetts has, and I'm a Florida lawyer, Massachusetts has in its state law a regulation requiring that the information security program actually be written. And unfortunately, it doesn't really provide a lot of guidance as to what that means, but that's a state law level requirement. Conversely, Florida does not have an analog requirement like that. So if I'm operating in Florida, I don't have a state law requirement that requires me to have any particular level of security or type of security or constraints on it. Instead, I'm kind of deferred back to, well, what then does set my structure if I'm in Florida? And the answer to that is, I have to look at what the security requirements are in the contracts that I'm entering into. So I need to comply with the contractual security requirements. I need to look at these patchwork laws that I just rattled off. And then I also need to consider, if I'm an officer and director, if I have a fiduciary responsibility to the company to properly oversee, maintain, monitor, guide, and direct security activities at the firm or at the company. And that is at this point, a line of case law that it's a little bit rocky as to when it applies or it doesn't, but it's developing. When I say it's developing, what I'm now saying is that increasingly you see fiduciary-based lawsuits going after officers and directors, saying you didn't carry out your fiduciary duty to properly secure the website or the website or the data, et cetera. And because of that, you then are responsible to the owners of the company, stockholders, et cetera, to reimburse us for the losses that that creates. So you have all of these different levels of responsibility. At a baseline, kind of summing it all up, you have to be at least reasonable in what you're doing. And that includes all the things we've talked about, which is written policies and procedures, contractual compliance, oversight from a board of directors standpoint, oversight from the chief executive officer, and so on. What doesn't fly anymore is to say, check the box, the IT director is responsible for that, because that's just not getting it done.
Understood. And in terms of, so you mentioned that there's federal compliance and then there's also state level compliance. Does that vary? Could that vary a fair amount between states?
It can, actually. You can have different levels of requirement. You have different attorneys general with different appetites for enforcement of security. And when I say that, that gives rise to a problem. And again, let's take this example of somebody with a business, we'll call it a bakery in Florida. If I'm only dealing with and accepting local orders and don't have any real connection or touch and concern, if you will, with any other state, then I should really pay a lot of attention to what Florida says and what the case law in Florida requires for security. If, on the other hand, I'm selling my baked goods by a gift basket and anybody in the 50 states that wants to can buy it, or if I wanted to, they could send it to Europe, I then have to think about what the requirements are for every state that I'm touching with respect to my gift baskets of bread and cookies and cakes and things like that. All of that then requires compliance.
Right. Okay. From a more, I guess, less technical standpoint, what are some tips that we can give to our viewers regarding some basic or some steps that every company or every organization should take toward improving their cybersecurity measures?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, why don't you learn what you don't know? And what I mean by that is, have your team, the team that you expect would be responsible for responding to a data breach, sit down and do a tabletop exercise. And a tabletop exercise is essentially a moderator. If you are a Dungeons and Dragons person from back in the 70s or 80s, you would know that's the dungeon master, or the person that's running the scenario. And they put together an idea or a scenario of what the problem is. It's a hypothetical problem. You then have the team that would be responsible for responding to this hypothetical data breach, talking and discussing what would they do. So if this happens, then we would do this. And I know that I would talk to the crisis communicator, and that would be this person who I've identified. And I would talk to this person who's the forensic investigator, that's a third party who we've identified already. And all of us would sit down and walk through this scenario. The reason I say to do that is because it tends to highlight where the issues are and the things that you don't know. And if you don't know them and you learn you don't know them, you can go and fix that. That, in one sense, if you've got no other idea what you're doing, sit down and just run a breach scenario on the table, and that'll kind of start pointing you in directions of things that you haven't done. The other thing I would say too is that you need to sit down, again, this is topical for now, is that if you haven't done this and you haven't done what I've been talking about, which is to sit down and consider how has life changed for us in a security posture based on work from home and the model of our company, I would sit down and think about that too. And I would come up with the company's policies and procedures, write those down, communicate those to your employees. And that again can be done by just thinking about it and all those things that I just talked about, which is Sally, who's now working from home, using a firm company issued computer and laptop with those security settings? Should she be? Is that the type of work that it matters? Is your system set up in such a way that that matters, and so on? Or is it okay if she used her 8-year-old laptop that hasn't been updated because they're no longer supporting Windows XP? And you think about those things and you start writing down what the edits and changes are. Those are just a couple of things that you can do that frankly will give you quite a bit to do and get you moving along the path of being in compliance with the different responsibilities that you have.
Right. That seems like it could be a whole other conversation in and of itself, steps an organization could take. That makes sense. So say that an organization does experience a data breach. What are some of the first steps that they should take from a practical standpoint in terms of addressing the issue of securing the data, and then what are some compliance regulations that organizations should be aware of?
At a very high level, because as you said, this is also another one of those things that we could spend hours talking about, but at a very high level, hopefully the organization has written out a data breach response plan, and again, has given some thought as to what that's going to look like. Part two of that is you then want to contact your lawyers, your forensics specialist, and your crisis communicators, as well as the persons in your company that have the most knowledge of the system, and you want to sit down and you want to have them start working the problem. So you first look at assessing what the issue is, deciding whether and if you need to communicate with the bad guys, if it's that kind of situation, whether or not a ransom can be paid, meaning it's permissible to, whether or not there's any interest in paying that, and so on. So you're basically working the problem in front of you with this team that you've pulled together on an emergency basis. Once you've achieved containment and you've stopped the issue, you then have to consider whether the data that was stolen or breached requires notification. And I believe now all 50 states have a data breach law that will tell you if your customer is resident in our state, then these are the requirements that you have for notice, both to the person and also to the attorney general or any other regulatory body in that state. So again, taking my bakery example, reiterating some, if I have data and personal information about the birth date and the driver's license because they cash checks and so on of somebody who's purchased from me and that information is stolen, that then would implicate, depending on where their residence is, a duty to comply with that state's law. And so you work the problem, then you start dealing with the regulatory notification and the personal notification as required, and frankly is a good business practice. And then once that is done, you then move through the question of, well, are we going to be sued? Was the information such that the person whose data was stolen is going to sue us? Is that going to be a class action? Is that going to be a regulatory action by an attorney general who says that our security was woefully inadequate, and so on? And then you also have to consider the problem of employees, and that employee information and data is also protected and should be protected. And employees have a right as well to sue if their data was compromised. So basically what I'm saying is containment, notice, and then responding to what the complaints are as they come in. Then after all of that, you then of course want to go through the postmortem, if you will, of what we should be doing to change our systems, both from a technical standpoint and from a policy and procedure standpoint, so that this doesn't happen again.
Got it. Drew, when you mentioned ransomware, you said you mentioned whether or not a ransom could be paid. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's typical. It used to be that let's back up even further. It used to be when ransomware first came on the scene that it was done as a malicious prank, meaning I've written this piece of malicious code, it's gone in and locked up your computer, and that's about it. You've now had thousands of dollars of damage done, kind of like vandalism. That then evolved to, we can take our malware, lock up your system, and export, and just at that point, it was just lock up your system, and then you can pay a ransom to us, a la ransomware, and we will give you the code to unencrypt the different files that we encrypted, so you pay us money and we let you off the hook. Again, it wasn't quite that simple, but that's the idea. Ransomers have now gotten even more sophisticated with, I'll call it the third generation of this problem, in that ransomers now are saying, pay us, and we're going to coerce you that if you don't pay us, we're going to post the information we stole on the internet so that anybody can see it. And that, of course, gives all kinds of issues of privacy and financial exploitation and so on. Now, we've actually hit the fourth level of that, which is that ransomers are now not only exporting the data, destroying your access to it, but unless you pay now, they're going to auction the data off on the dark web so that I will, if I'm a bad guy, you can pay me $1 million, I'll ransom it off and I'll get 500,000 because of all the credit card numbers from this other bad guy that wants to use it for some other reason. And so they've, in essence, commoditized this particular bad act. Now, to answer your other part of your question, why do I say if you're allowed to? I say that because the federal government has recently announced, under what's a company called OFAC, which is a subdivision of the Department of Treasury, OFAC is now saying that if you pay a ransom to a ransomer who is on a list of, I'll I'll call it terrorist states. That's the most simple way to put it. Terrorists, bad guys, organized crime, etc. If you pay that, then you can be subject to fines and penalties. And you can be subject to those fines and penalties even if you don't know when you pay it that they are a person who's disallowed on one of these lists. And so 2 years from now, you pay your ransom, you think it's nothing. OFAC finds out that this is an actuality, a rogue state, and then they come after you saying you've paid money that you're not supposed to. And you've now supported terrorism, and because of that, you're in violation of US law and regulation. That's why I'm saying now there's a question of whether or not you're allowed to pay it. Technically, it's always been illegal in my opinion, but now you're actually seeing where regulatory bodies are coming in and taking action with respect to that.
Okay, that's interesting. Good to know. Anything else, Drew, that you think our viewers should be aware of today as it relates to cybersecurity?
It is Cybersecurity Month, and so there's nothing wrong with, I think, telling somebody not only Happy Halloween, but Happy Cybersecurity Month. So that's something for you to do too.
Okay, well, happy Halloween and happy Cybersecurity Month, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. And if you guys have any questions related to cybersecurity, please feel free to reach out to either Drew Sorrell or myself. My name is Ferran Arimon. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Lowndes Legal Talk. For more information about today's topic or to learn more about our attorneys and practices, please visit lowndes-law.com.